Well, thank you very much for taking the time being here. And I also want to say a warm hello to the several folks that are on Zoom with us today. Well, were women irrelevant to Beethoven's music? Could almost get that impression. The fact that women didn't just cross his path, but shaped his life and music is rarely discussed. It has long bothered me that talk of Beethoven and women keeps circling one question. Who was the so-called immortal beloved? And more broadly, which named women were romantically involved and which works supposedly encode a suppressed, unhappy love? This reduction to romance persists in public discourse and still today in Beethoven scholarship. This is where my project comes in. I do not want to perpetuate the 19th century topos of the solitary genius. I rather try to approach Beethoven as a sociable historical person, communicative, engaged with both women and men, even as deafness curtailed his hearing. In the late Enlightenment, gender was conceived as complementary, men and women, different yet equal, together realizing the idea of the fully human, a view shared by Rousseau, Kant, Herder, Humboldt, and certainly also Beethoven. The autobiographical interpretation of Beethoven's works as products of the cultural hero and solitary genius is a tradition that, as Mark Evan Barnes has shown, emerged only after his death in 1827 and was later deepened by psychological readings. I do not continue that line. Instead, I trace Beethoven's interactions with music-loving personalities and relate those ties to his compositions. This reframes him within the era's social, cultural, and aesthetic constellations. Music in the context of friendship, as communication in Koshorke's sense, as social capital in Bourdieu's sense, and as a vibrating together of two souls. The portraits of Beethoven illustrate how stubbornly the narrative of the lonely hero became entrenched during the 19th century. The paintings by Julius Schmidt from around 1900 can serve as a representative case in point, reiterating and visually codifying the Beethoven image established in the 19th century. Here, Beethoven is brooding alone in nature. In a second painting by Schmidt, the scowl is even more striking. Let us compare this with Schmidt's painting of Franz Schubert. He is sitting at the piano in the salon, communicating with those present. Schmidt also painted Beethoven in company at Prince Lichnowsky's residence. Women and men listened to him enraptured. But look how Beethoven, even in company, is still absorbed in his genius, scowling at the piano, quite unlike Schubert. When it comes to the role of women, there is also another pictorial topos. Beethoven is alone again. The female figures are allegorically depicted as muses, and by no means as earthly, equal, communicative beings. The image of the unsociable lovelorn figure aligns seamlessly with the 19th century figure of the artist hero. This concept is inextricably bound to the idea that the hero pursues a higher, quasi-divine mission in solitude, an intention to everyday life. Consequently, he appears isolated from childhood onward and fixed on his messianic task. Social bonds, especially with women, rarely succeed, and at best the woman appears as an angelic muse. Hegel puts it starkly. With marriage, the hero becomes a Philistine. The grip of the heroic topos makes it hard to dislodge the solitary genius image in favor of more sociable readings, especially regarding women, not least because the scant contemporary record of Beethoven's interactions with women has long been overlaid with posthumous memories, interpretations, and projections. In my study, I ask what active roles women played in Beethoven's composing, performing, and publishing. I trace how he responded to stimuli and opportunities created by music-loving women, and how these encounters are reflected in his works. Since most of the women for whom Beethoven wrote belonged to the aristocracy, or at least the upper middle class, my project also contributes to the history of the nobility around 1800. There is work to do. 19th century music historiography, shaped by bourgeois male ideals and a hunger for heroes, cast the aristocracy as decadent and backward, and thus implied that a revolutionary Beethoven could hardly have cared for it. The result was a flattening. Beethoven's rich dealings with nobles were reduced to utilitarian and financial motives, leaving little room for the aristocratic women. This entrenched picture, already in Anton Schindler, continued by Thayer, and still influential in Calles, no longer holds in light of recent research on the nobility in the late Holy Roman Empire. Trace the women who mattered in Beethoven's musical life, I focus primarily on those to whom he dedicated works. Over 2/3 of the works he published in his lifetime bear a dedication, from the very first Bonn Prince to the last in Vienna. Here you see a typical title page dedication. The dedicatee's name is often printed larger than the composer's. Almost all of Beethoven's dedicatees, 63 individuals in total, 40 men and 23 women, knew him personally and shared his commitment to a rarefied ideal of music that functioned as social and symbolic capital for all involved. Earlier scholarship, which took aristocrats to be largely uninterested in the music and treated dedications primarily as tactics to obtain funding, needs revision. Dedications adorn a commodity, a printed score, but operate within a gift economy. No price is stipulated. Like wrapping, the dedication frames a work meant to please its recipient. It also implies reciprocity, a valuable object, or more rarely money, and especially in the case of women, other forms of support before or after the dedication. Beethoven often tailored pieces to their dedicatees in style, instrumentation, and genre, and at times forged specific musical connections. In this way, dedications can shed light on a work's genesis, early performances, and perceived meanings. Dedications are gender-specific. Men are reserved for the public genres, such as symphonies and string quartets, which are considered particularly learned, although works in other genres are possible. Women receive dedications exclusively for works that belong to the domestic salon, compositions for piano, including songs. It is no coincidence that these were works for precisely those two instruments, piano and voice, that women were allowed to learn at the time. There are only two exceptions among Beethoven's dedications. He wrote a septet for Empress Marie-Thérèse, who, as John Rice has shown, had a particular fondness for this rare genre. And he dedicated not only the piano sonata Opus 40 No. 1, but also its string quartet arrangement to Baroness Josephine von Braun. This was strategic. Josephine's husband, Peter von Braun, directed and leased the two imperial court theaters, and Beethoven needed his authorization to book them. In the end, the charm offensive failed, and von Braun refused him the use of the theater despite the dedications to his wife. Beethoven's brother, Caspar Karl, vented their frustration in a letter. The theater director, Baron von Braun, well known as a stupid and coarse man, has turned down my brother's request to use the theater for his academy. And I believe that he's right to feel he's being treated disgracefully, especially since the Baron has no reason for it, and my brother has dedicated several works to his wife. Notably, Beethoven sometimes composed works for high-ranking women in genres he would not otherwise have explored. We already heard from the septet for the Empress, but also he composed a polonaise for the Russian Tsarina Elizabeth Alexeyevna, who was in Vienna in 1814 and wanted to hear him play. For years, she had traditionally received a polonaise as a birthday gift. Or a set of Italian arietas for an aristocratic singer, and I'll return to these little-known pieces at the end, and you've heard one of them at the beginning as a prelude. Although aristocratic women typically had limited personal funds and thus could not offer substantial material support, they advanced Beethoven's career in other decisive ways. Some were accomplished interpreters of his works, for example, Countess Babette von Keglowitz, dedicatee of several major piano pieces, including the first piano concerto. Others organized the musical salons in which he networked and performed, as with Princess Lichnowsky. Her husband is remembered as an important early patron in Vienna, but she ran the weekly gatherings and also received significant dedications. When considering music making in salons, a persistent misconception must be addressed. It is not necessary to interpret Beethoven's visit to surrogate families in terms of repressed childhood trauma, as Maynard Solomon, one of the most influential Beethoven biographers in the second half of the 20th century, suggested. Beethoven's involvement with music-loving households is better understood as a professional strategy common among musicians of the time. He sought out families in which music held social or cultural value. Salons offered an ideal forum to display his abilities. The dedications of his piano and chamber music reflect these conditions. For Beethoven, making music in these circles was less a private pastime or a pretext for courtship than a vital part of his profession. Many of the young women he encountered were capable pianists whom he taught, sought to impress, and composed for, as was expected of a successful salon musician. In this context, the handwritten dedication on a piano trio movement from 1812 is telling. It says on the top, "For my little friend Maxe Brentano to encourage her piano playing," Ludwig van Beethoven. Maxe, then 12 years old, was the daughter of his friends Franz and Antonie Brentano, and Beethoven would later dedicate his piano sonata opus 109 publicly to her. Beethoven's formative years in Bonn had already immersed him in aristocratic musical patronage, notably involving women. He dedicated his demanding variations on a theme by Regini to Countess Hortensia von Hatzfeld, a highly regarded singer and pianist active in Bonn, Mainz, and Vienna. Contemporary accounts attest to her exceptional expressivity. And in a retrospective note from 1824, Anton Reicher recalled her Bonn court performance of Letras tutte nel cor vi sento from Mozart's Idomeneo that so deeply affected him and his friend Beethoven that they continued to dream about it for weeks afterward. As one reviewer remarked, the successful Viennese reception of Mozart's Idomeneo in Vienna in 1786 owed much to Hatzfeld's art of singing. After criticizing Mozart's opera as too overladen with accompaniments, and noting that it was much less acclaimed than his piano concertos, he continued, "The Countess Hatzfeld, who sings splendidly and nearly surpasses our stories, has given Herr Mozart a considerable gift. Were Herr Mozart richer than the Countess, it would be up to him to dispense gifts. For his opera, gained in the eyes of connoisseurs through her singing, not she through the opera. So in short, Mozart's composition did not fully convince, but Hatzfeld's interpretation redeemed it." Beethoven's variations honor Hatzfeld through the choice of theme by her teacher Regini and a clear reference to Mozart, with whom she was close. Her musical expertise shows in the substantial compositional challenges and the wide expressive range. My favorite passages, however, are in the final variations, where variations 23 begins with the German folk song Winter ade, scheiden tut weh, farewell to winter, parting is painful, marked tenuto. And the piece closes with a farewell in horn fifths, echoing, as I see it, Beethoven's own parting from Bonn. We do not know whether Hatzfeld supported Beethoven financially, yet her patronage appears to have been crucial in introducing him to Vienna's aristocratic musical connoisseurs. Her reputation and connections likely accelerated his early success, alongside the famous reference by Count Ferdinand von Waldstein. But I think this is only part of the true story, the Waldstein story. This set of variations served as his calling card when he arrived in Vienna in 1792, the city where Hatzfeld had grown up and built her network. When the variations were publicly dedicated, it was Hatzfeld who made the young Beethoven shine, not the other way around. A universally acclaimed singer in demanding contemporary roles, she lent the work prestige. Her name signaled to audiences that the newcomer from Bonn was first rate. Within the genre of piano variations, the share of works dedicated to women is particularly high. Of 14 dedicated sets, 10 go to women. The female ones are marked in red, so this is all you have to see on this slide. I know it's too small. This pattern conspicuously aligns with the fact that these works, especially the earlier sets on popular operatic tunes, have often been dismissed as light. As indicated in the right column here, many of these women received multiple dedications, including more serious works for piano. If read as a form of sociable musical discourse, Beethoven's use and interpretation of borrowed themes becomes a lens on his dialogue with informed listeners of the time. In many cases, he seems to comment musically on the meanings of these fashionable tunes, including making puns. Seen this way, a social perspective alters the canon of relevant works, bringing into focus compositions long deemed atypical for Beethoven and therefore long underappreciated. Let us turn briefly to the dedications of Beethoven's sonatas, the pinnacle of his composing for the piano. 10 sonatas are dedicated to women, 13 to men, and 7 have no dedication. Almost all of the listed dedicatees, both male and female, were capable of performing the sonata dedicated to them. This also applies notably to the late dedications to Archduke Rudolf, Maximiliane Brentano, and Dorothea von Erdmann, all 3 of whom were outstanding pianists regularly performing in the aristocratic salons. The high level of pianistic skill among Viennese female virtuosos and dilettantes, which was apparently no way inferior to that of their male colleagues, is well documented by contemporary sources. It is therefore not surprising that Beethoven dedicated both easy and demanding works to women throughout his life, including in his later years. And I stress this because it is still widely maintained that only men in Beethoven's day played his works properly. You can feel some of it still today, I think. But well. In the time we have left, let me share a concrete example in order to show how our view of Beethoven's music changes when we consider the dedicatee's identity and the world she moved in. To Beethoven scholars, the name Kinski has always been familiar because of the annuity contract of 1809. Prince Kinski was the one who paid the most of the 3. Beethoven, in turn, thanked his patrons, among other things, by publicly dedicating compositions to them. Archduke Rudolf was a dedicatee of significant piano compositions. Beethoven, moreover, dedicated the Missa Solemnis to him, originally conceived to Rudolf's inauguration as Bishop of Olomouc. And as a fervent lover of fugues, he also received the dedication of the Große Fuge. Prince Lobkowitz, who kept a distinguished household orchestra, was a dedicatee of the 5th and 6th symphonies, and as an amateur violinist and an admirer of string quartets, of the Opus 74. Following his bankruptcy, which compelled him to disband his orchestra, Beethoven dedicated the song cycle An die ferne Geliebte to him. As I argue in a separate paper that I will present in 2 weeks at the music department, this song cycle was conceived as a work of consolation in memory of his recently deceased wife, Princess Maria Caroline. In this sense, she too should be counted among the figures relevant to Beethoven's composing. If one examines Beethoven's dedications to the Kinski family, it quickly becomes clear that Ferdinand received a dedication of only a single work, the Mass, whereas 4 dedications, all songs, were addressed to his wife Charlotte. This struck me as remarkable and prompted me to examine the couple more closely. So I carried out quite a bit of research in archives in Bohemia and Vienna, and indeed I soon discovered that Charlotte was a gifted singer. This explains Beethoven's choice to dedicate songs to her. So, who was she? Charlotte von Kerpen grew up in the respected emperor-loyal and distinctly musical family in Koblenz. During a visit to Koblenz, Leopold Mozart praised the family's musicianship, noting that all 9 children were active, singing or playing violin, cello, and keyboard, and that the families enjoyed musicking together. The Napoleonic Wars forced the Kaplan family to leave their seat in Koblenz in 1792 when Charlotte was 10. They now had to build a new life as emigrants in Prague, largely deprived of their previous source of income. There, Charlotte von Kerpen married the imperial commander Prince Kinsky in 1801. The fact that Ferdinand waived a dowry suggests that the bride did not bring much money into the marriage, but apparently had beauty, charm, and an excellent training as a musician. At least two major works were explicitly composed for the wedding celebrations. Giovanni Liverati composed an Azione Teatrale, which is a short opera, on a famous text by the imperial court poet Metastasio that had been performed at the wedding of Joseph II. And Wenzel Tomaszek composed a German-language solo cantata, Vermählungsfeier. This cantata is especially remarkable since it features not at all a ready-made text, but thematizes the personal fate of Charlotte as an emigrant in vivid word and tone painting. In the end, the marriage with Prince Ferdinand is depicted as a replacement for the lost Heimat. Charlotte collected music for her own use as a soprano, personally inscribing the covers and maintaining detailed inventories. Today, this collection is preserved in the Kinsky Library in Prague. It comprises several hundred items of vocal music, arias and other excerpts from Italian and German operas, Italian canzonettas, German lieder, as well as some piano pieces and a substantial amount of music for English guitar, which was fashionable at the time. The collection also includes instructional manuals for voice, piano, and guitar, which treat basso continuo, harmony, and other foundational aspects of music theory. Learning an instrument was not merely a practical accomplishment, but a pathway to a deeper musical understanding. Charlotte's music collection offers a rare, intimate glimpse into the private musical life of an aristocratic woman and her household around 1800. Several works written for her and surviving correspondence indicate that she used her singing to convey affection and emotional closeness to her husband. Here is an example, a serenade for solo voice, a piccolo sorpresa, a small surprise for her husband, and performed in his garden at Budenitz on the evening of September the 2nd, 1808. Here you can see a letter from Ferdinand to Charlotte in which he announces he will return a few days late because he wishes rather to go deer hunting. He encloses a love poem, Je t'aime tout, not his own, but still. And the very poem also appears as a song in her music collection. Since the manuscript bears the ownership mark Ferdinand Kinsky, we can be confident that in this case, Ferdinand took part in the music making, either as guitarist or as a singer. By virtue of her aristocratic rank, Charlotte did not perform in public, but, as records show, she sang in the salons of her peers in illustrious company. For example, in a concert at the Palais Lobkowitz, in which Archduke Rudolf played a piano concerto by Beethoven and a sonata by Prince Louis Ferdinand. Afterward, Charlotte sang the third act of Zingarelli's Giulietta e Romeo, including the celebrated Ombra Adorata, one of her signature pieces. Charlotte was also the dedicatee of at least 10 printed compositions, almost all vocal works. So you get, for example, lieder by Tomaszek, cavatine by Sandrini, songs by Beethoven and Himmel, and as late as 1828, a set of songs by Franz Schubert after he had given a recital in her palace in Vienna. Giovanni Liverati served in the early 19th century as music director at the Italian Opera at Prague's Estates Theatre, and he was Charlotte's music teacher and voice teacher especially. So he dedicated his Sei Ariette explicitly to his pupil Charlotte Kinsky, sua scolara. 3 of these ariettas were composed for Charlotte already in 1808 at the Kinsky summer retreat in Budenitz, together with the piccolo sorpresa we just had before. Liberati's role as her voice teacher is unmistakable from the collection. He not only composed numerous pieces tailored to her voice, but he also instructed her in Italian ornamentation as evidenced by the extensive pencil annotations throughout her Italian repertoire. Notably, the pieces dedicated to her were ones she herself performed and commanded with authority, challenging the still common historiographical claim that aristocratic women typically did not perform works dedicated to them. And I still can't believe that this trope is still around because the evidence is so, I mean, it would be there if people had looked at it. After the war hero Prince Ferdinand Kinsky died suddenly in a riding accident, he was just drunk and was riding home and was falling off his horse after he had, well, not the best end for a war hero. Well, in 1812, Charlotte's life changed in many ways. As a widow, she largely withdrew from active singing, yet music continued to shape her self-conception and identity. As shown in this interior drawing, she placed a portrait of her late husband alongside portraits of her two sons above the grand piano. In her salon, the members of the family, living and deceased, remained present and connected. What ultimately matters, of course, is how these stories of dedication resonate in Beethoven's music. In order to give you an idea of that, let me turn to two specific examples. Beethoven's setting of Goethe's Es war einmal ein König, one of the 6 songs from Opus 75 dedicated to Charlotte, gains clarity when situated within the context of aristocratic lead culture of the time. What appears as an awkward peculiarity, the sudden entrance of a choir at the end, a nightmare for today's performers in a concert, would have felt entirely natural in a salon where several musically literate family members, friends, and guests were present and accustomed to joining in. The piece that presupposes a social environment in which singing was a shared activity rather than a strictly staged performance. Beethoven's choice of Goethe's text must be understood against the broader cultural backdrop. Goethe was widely read among aristocratic circles in Vienna, and personal connections existed as well. As Goethe's diaries attest, the Kinskys met the German poet during the spa season in Bohemia in 1810. Goethe was particularly taken there with Charlotte's sister, who later sent him her own paintings from Vienna and received in return a warm letter of thanks in which Goethe hinted at, but never realized, a visit to Vienna. In this light, it is hardly surprising that 6 of Beethoven's 10 Goethe settings were dedicated to Charlotte Kinsky. I have to add, I mean, if you read about these Goethe songs, it's always like Beethoven could only, take Goethe's, it's all about these masters, but it's a different trope. Goethe's text marks misused privilege and bureaucratic absurdity. That tone would have suited the Kinsky circle, known for its skepticism toward ministers and its anti-Napoleonic alignment with Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia. After his heroic death, his music stayed central to the circle. As we've heard before, Charlotte even sang in a concert with works by both Beethoven and Louis Ferdinand. In such a setting, the song's sharp humor and its final choral refrain would have landed with a knowing smile. And I want to listen with you to at least to the end of the song together.
Und Herren und Frauen am Hofe, die waren sehr geplagt. Die Königin und die Zofe, gestochen und genagt. Und durften sie nicht knicken und weg sie jucken nicht. Wir knicken und ersticken, doch gleich, wenn einer sticht. Wir knicken und ersticken, doch gleich, wenn einer sticht. Und ersticken, doch gleich, wenn einer sticht. Ja, dann wir knicken und ersticken, doch gleich, wenn einer sticht.
I will conclude with Beethoven's four arietas and a duet, also written in 1809. This opus lacks Kinski's name, but Beethoven's correspondence with the publisher strongly suggests that he intended to dedicate it to her and that the credit was mistakenly omitted. Given Charlotte Kinski's fondness for Italian arietas, such a dedication is of course especially apt. Beethoven may even have adopted the genre for her. Max Unger's 1930s suggestion that the pieces were for Therese Alfatti, whom Beethoven courted in 1810, is still widely repeated today, but it lacks support. There is no evidence Therese sang, and the autograph of the Arietta No. 4 is dated 1809, months before Beethoven met the Malfatti family in 1810. So this supposed link can be set aside. My study of Kinski's music collection points to a different scenario. Beethoven fashioned a lesson in love from 3 Metastasio poems, one of them set twice, and a new opening text. The poems, as you can see, come from very different contexts. So, who chose them for him? Well, Charlotte already owned settings of all 3 of these texts. And given that the duet O di Laura che dolce sospira had scarcely been set, only 3 settings are known, 2 of which Charlotte owned, this is unlikely to be accidental. Instead, Beethoven, or an advisor, seems to have drawn the poems from her collection, thus tailoring the selection to her tastes, inviting direct artistic comparison with the settings she knew. We can't go into these arietas in detail here, but let me stress, they are real gems. You heard one of it at the beginning of the talk. In Beethoven's scholarship, they are usually dismissed and are rarely performed, perhaps because they don't fit the familiar Germanic image of Beethoven. His choice of Metastasian texts is likewise often labeled old-fashioned. Yet around 1800, Italian language arietas and canzonettas were immensely popular. They were commonly seen as for women, but distinguished male connoisseurs received them too. Prince Lobkowitz, for example, was presented with the print in Questa tomba oscura, which gathers 63 different settings of a poem by Carpani. Another compilation assembled 34 canzonettas on 6 poems connected to Archduke Rudolf. In both cases, a single poem is explored musically from multiple perspectives, which reflects contemporary debates about music's interpretive power. With its double setting of Metastasio's Che fa il mio bene, once as an arietta buffa, once as an arietta sei seriosa, Beethoven is very much in step with this fashion of multiple settings. At the same time, he makes it unmistakably clear that he himself can offer different readings of the same text in distinct styles, just as he later does on a grand scale in his Diabelli variation. So let's listen to the openings of these 2 settings.
Che fa il mio bene? Perché conviene vedermi volerla qui, così. Che fa il mio bene? Perché non
Conclude. The point of departure from my paper today was the observation that aristocratic women have been largely marginalized in 19th century Beethoven biography. Shaped by a bourgeois, anti-aristocratic worldview and by the ideal of a heroic masculinity, these narratives tended to acknowledge women only as unattainable beloved, muses to be yearned for, rather than historical actors. That pattern has, in many respects, persisted to the present. Yet, as my research makes clear, noble women did indeed play crucial and diverse roles in Beethoven's musical world, as musical exemplars and pioneers, for instance, Countess Hatzfeld. As remarkable students and interpreters, whose artistry inspired Beethoven, such as Countess Keglewitz or Baroness Erdmann. as cultivated, musically literate organizers of salons, spaces of exchange, performance, and formation of taste. And in some cases, as patrons, from Empress Marie-Therese to the Russian Empress and to Princess Kinsky. Many of the works dedicated to these women are in fact shaped quite specifically to their abilities, temperaments, and circumstances. In keeping with the principle of Uptum, Beethoven composed in these cases not as an isolated, self-absorbed genius, but as a responsive and attentive collaborator, writing for particular individuals and within particular social settings. Attending to the aristocratic women in Beethoven's orbit thus brings new discursive terrains into view. It encourages us to consider topics such as music and sensibility, inwardness, and the fashioning of the self. Music as a medium of friendship, memory, and shared experience. Music as communication, above all in the salon. This shift in perspective inevitably changes the canon we habitually invoke, and with it, the figure of Beethoven we imagine. It asks us to see not primarily the heroic, defiant master, but also the engaged, communicative musician, someone capable of listening, of responding with nuance and empathy, and of shaping his art in dialogue with the cultivated aristocratic world in which he lived. Perhaps in allowing that Beethoven too, we gain a fuller, more human, and ultimately richer sense of the composer we thought we already knew. Thank you very much.
In that case, I'm going to insert myself and abuse my chair's privilege. I was wondering, you spoke a lot about sort of about how these dedications were a method of communication, that the women sort of played this important role in both advancing Beethoven's career and as friends. Do you have any evidence, any sort of written documents, any diaries from the women dedicatees themselves and how they perceived the dedications, what they thought of them?
We would love to have that. Unfortunately, there is none. I was digging a lot. I found diaries of Dorothea von Erdmann, but they are the diaries of his husband, I found out. They're in Graz. And he says in his diaries that he wrote the diaries whenever he was traveling. He was a military officer as well, but hers are lost. So, and I didn't get closer than that. Of course, we would love to have that, but so far I haven't found any.
So this is an unfair question because you've already done so much work here, and then now it's a question about more work. But I'm wondering sort of how these patterns you think would compare sort of other figures less grand than Beethoven, perhaps, in Vienna at the same time. Do you think sort of, if you chose sort of all of kind of the sort of the freelance composer, this sort of thinking, do you think there's anything particular here, or do you think this would be sort of broadly true of most of the composers in the patterns that we find from the dedications?
You nailed it. I think it's the common practice in, and not only in Vienna, but at the time. Maybe we should do a research project. I mean, I always dream at least to trace all the dedications. I mean, if I find a personality, it's hard because library catalogs normally don't I mean, they abbreviate the titles, so even a personality like Lobkowitz or so, you have to look for a long time to find what was dedicated to him. Not in Beethoven. We know what Beethoven dedicated, but all the other artworks or texts or whatever. And I think that really this is an underestimated, I mean, source that we could exploit much more if we knew more about it. Yeah. Yep.
I'm wondering, after Beethoven's death, how these salons developed, or I think at least the impression I had of Beethoven after his death is he sort of became this recluse and only
yeah. Very good point. Thank you for that. So he's still, I mean, we have a lot of these records where people say he was sort of grumpy guy and didn't really, I mean, he had a hard time replying, and he got shyer because he just couldn't talk so well in society. But on the other hand, we have very interesting, he still attended, for example, he was often with the Brentanos and with the children of the Brentanos also. I mean, I showed this one dedication to Maxi. And he always asks about how the kids were, and he says when they move to Frankfurt that he'll miss their company, miss being with them. And so there is still evidence, but it grew less because he just couldn't do it that well anymore. So yes. Mm-hmm.
Birgit, thank you so much. Wonderful talk and learned so much. I feel like I can say characteristically virtuosic, bringing together so much material, including a lot of material we didn't know before, and also in doing so, correcting a historiography that, as you say, has been very lopsided. So thank you so much. My question is one that you will have anticipated. I feel like no matter how you approach this topic, there's something of a trap. And I'm wondering if you could just say more about how you think about that trap, which is that in a way, the more attention we give to figures who are of this sort, the more attention we inevitably give to figures we can't help but characterize as in some way peripheral to Beethoven. Beethoven remains the center of the story, or Beethoven's music remains the center of the story, no matter what we do. And I wonder just how you think about that. I feel like toward the end, in the musical examples and your conclusion, you gave some answers to that. But just how you think about that problem in this case and maybe more generally.
I hope I get your question right. I mean, I always have the problem it's always related to Rowan's question. I mean, it is a typical pattern, and I decided to tell a story around Beethoven. And I thought a long time about it, but I think, I mean, for none of these women, despite the Kinski, by now I could write a book on Charlotte Kinski. I got so much material on her, and it'll be a second book. But to tell the real story of these women, there is too few material. I mean, most of the personal material is lost, so you end up having. So in the end, I thought, since the general picture of Beethoven is still so man-centered, and first thing we think about his symphonies and the grand compositions that are not in the salon, and I just felt the need to give another perspective to Beethoven. But I don't know whether I answered your question, or did I get it right?
I think it's a bit of question about the stakes and whether the stakes are ultimately Beethoven or these women or the social relations at the time, or maybe all of those, and how those come into balance when doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I think it would be worthwhile really studying the relevance of music. This is also why I alluded to Bourdieu once in a while. The relevance of music in the aristocratic life of the time. It was really important. I mean, before they had their private orchestras, their string quartets, but they still invested a lot of money in the education, in hosting events. So this was and historians haven't been very good in tracing the aristocrats at that time. After the French Revolution, the interests shifted, and so this is why I devoted a passage to this problem: how aristocrats are perceived at that time. And I mean, of course, they're all different. They were not all into music, but there is nothing there where I could just take material and say, oh yeah, the aristocrats in Vienna or around that did this or that. It's just non-existent. But if someone has a recommendation for me, I would be happy to know about that. Mm-hmm.
So how often did you
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I can provide you with a list about that, dedications to non-aristocrats, but there's very few actually. There's some There's a dedication to his teacher, the Opus 2, to Joseph Haydn, to some musicians, but those are more the exceptions. Yeah.
Sorry, you wanted to ask a question?
You said that Kinski paid him 1,800 a year.
Yeah.
What would that translate in modern dollars and cents?
I don't want to
it a-
say the wrong thing. It's a sum. I think it's exactly the sum that his wife was allowed to spend, was given the moment he died. It was like her widow's pension. But I can check that up. There's a wonderful calculator on the website of the city of Vienna where you can put in you can say
I
it.
just looked it up. It's around, so 1,800 thaler would be around $46,000.
Okay,
So it's a,
46,000. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting. It's sort of a two-part question, but would you say that essentially that the women became, like Kinski became sort of curators of arts, protectors, if you will, of art and music education, if you will, at these courts and, also for their communities in some sense. And that you would think that they established sort of the modern day solicitation of fundraising models, because these composers probably understood if they could make an impact in these circles, that they would have the support, and maybe this was sort of the starting ground of their encouragement to try elsewhere, because then they have the support of somebody who is a respected member of high society.
Well, I think you can see it that way, and we know that this continued throughout the 19th century. If you think about Chopin, for example, I mean, it was a very big element of his career that he succeeded in the salons. And it's only until later that the salons sort of deteriorate in quality. Then you get these salon pieces and these, but they did I mean, again, so there is also salons where they only read text. There is salons where they are really into a sort of good music. Then there is other ones, but in general, it was more at Beethoven's time. They were, I mean, and no one, I have to add that no one played a piano sonata in a concert hall. I mean, you played a piano concerto there, but not a piano sonata. And you didn't sing these songs in a concert hall. You sang arias. I mean, you know that. So these were like the breeding ground in various ways. You alluded to the fundraising or the yes, that's one part, but also it was sort of important to play a part there. So also the kids were trained in music. They were literate in talking about music. They trained their ears. So there was, and that also was important when you went to the opera, to the concert publicly. It was not like today that it was considered something only jerks are doing. It was something really valid, and so also for that, it's an important breeding ground or important, column of society where this kind of culture was really, trained and fostered. Yes.
So you would agree then this was sort of the starting point of the modern day independent composer who was not reliant on just being part of as a court composer per
Yes.
se, or yeah, kind of.
Definitely, because as a court composer, Beethoven tried all his life to get a job as a court composer. He never did again. He was in Bonn, but he wasn't very successful with the emperor. So he tried with Archduke Rudolph, but he also didn't hire him for that. So that was still the easiest way to make a living. But other than that, this kind of establishing oneself and many of the young composers were house piano teachers for a noble person, and so this is how you made your living. Yes, very much. Yeah. And then when you were more advanced, you could sell your compositions, but that was later in the career, and no one could really live from that. And the concerts, I mean, Beethoven also organized his own concerts, but that was he couldn't live from that either. I mean, he made some money with it, but it wasn't that it was so stable. Yeah.
Another question? Did you have another question?
I could ask another one. Just thinking about your comment about Maynard Solomon's work, and
Yeah.
and that's always tricky stuff. I mean, interpretively, it's pretty heavy-handed, right?
Mhm.
And yet he's trying, I guess, to read from the read between the lines of the
Yes.
documentary evidence towards some sort of psychoanalytic interpretation.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could say more about, or whether it's possible, let's say, that both things could be true. That sort of there could be. Because I guess in one view,
Yeah.
Beethoven becomes a little bit a victim of his psyche, and in the other, he has agency. And could it be both?
I would agree. It could be both. But I must say that I loved Solomon's biography when it came out, sort of in my early days of dealing with Beethoven. I thought it was a very inspiring biography, very personal and very, but the older I get, the more tricky I find it. And so I think it's really hard. I would be careful to do too much psycho on a historical person. Plus, this problem with he has also a problem with the Bonn phase, with the aristocrats. So it's sort of these tropes, they are around, and he's also he doesn't leave them. But in the end, I mean, Beethoven had a very hard time when he grew up in Bonn. He was the guardian of his younger siblings, and he didn't have parents anymore. I mean, his mother died pretty early, and his father wasn't reliable. So it can add to yeah. So I wouldn't say it's not possible that there was that it was both. Yeah. I wanted to make my point very, very clear, because normally you just get stuck in what Beethoven, I mean, this autobiographical trope. And this is certainly, if so, only half of what he did. Or what also accounts for his music.
Well, thank you so much for
The chat.
Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful talk. We all learned.